Good morning, welcome, and thank you all for joining us today, and thank you to our partners and colleagues from the Ukraine World Congress. We have an interesting and compelling discussion on the war in Ukraine for you today. We're delighted to have an esteemed panel of experienced warfighters and military strategists who have multiple decades of wisdom. And I'm honored to be the moderator for this impressive panel. General Rick Hillier, General David Petraeus, General Wesley Clark, and General Mick Ryan. I'd like to open with a very few brief remarks. During the past 30 years, the United States, Canada, and Europe, and our allies in the Indo-Pacific have quietly transformed their original defense alliances into a community of over 1 billion democratic peoples, which stretches from the Russian border in Europe to the border between the United States and Russia in the Bering Straits. Its reach extends far beyond that of NATO into the Pacific and can ensure that democracy remains the operating system of the modern world. Ukraine's main sin in Putin's eyes is its desire to become part of this community. And with that, I would like to turn to each of our panelists to open with some brief remarks. I ask each panelist to keep their remarks down to about 3 or 4 minutes. Thank you very much. I'm going to start with General Hillier. Thank you very much, sir. Over to you. Sir, if you could unmute, please.
Deborah, thank you. And let me just say thank you to the Atlantic Council team for putting this event on. And thank you to you for being our master of ceremonies today. And lastly, thank you to my friend, General David Petraeus and General Wes Clark for participating here, and General Mick Ryan, who is participating and contributing to his first event as part of the Strategic Advisory Council. And of course, Paul Grod, who is the president of the Ukrainian World Congress and who was sort of had a period to the end of our discussions here in his summary. I just want to make, in the very short period of time I have, 4 overarching points. And these are not about short-term or tactics or military. They're just overarching things which I believe are fundamental to Ukraine having success in the war against the brutal Russian invasion in this next 12 to 24 to 36 months, with no time lag or no timeline being actually predictable. 4 points that I really want to make, each of which are intertwined and all rest upon each other. Point number 1, and I really do think about this a lot because it could explode upon us in greater style, is the ability by Ukraine to combat corruption inside of the country, inside of procurement agencies, and particularly with the use of the funding, the money, the support, the logistics, and the equipment provided by the West in particular to enable them to fight the Russians. President Zelensky and his national command team have been working hard to fight the corruption, which has been systemic from the days of the breakup of the Soviet Union and moving forward. It is one of those things that could come crashing down unless the West perceives that all efforts are being made to combat it, that no effort is sort of restrained or constrained, and that it is being reduced on a daily basis because voters in the Western democracies will not support billions of dollars and billions of dollars worth of equipments going into Ukraine if they get the perception that it is being stolen, it is being robbed, and it is lining the pockets of those who are responsible for the procurement of that. Corruption is a crucial issue. It's kind of a bug on the back of everybody in that national command authority, but equally in the West. Corruption has got to be fought by Ukraine. Secondly, the West has got to remain united and solid in its support to Ukraine. And by this, the West, I'm talking specifically NATO, but in addition to that, the European Union. And now NATO and the EU and those Orban and Hungary and their resistance to doing things for Ukraine, and in fact, sometimes a de facto support for Russia, and how NATO and the EU will handle Turkey and Erdogan and their approach to Russia and Ukraine and the war there will be crucial in this. The West at large, not just the United States of America, has to pick up more support for Ukraine, more weapons, more sanctions, more money, and more logistical support, and specifically more training in order to help Ukraine be successful against this brutal invader. I worry about the unity and the solidness of the Western Front as I look at the dialogue that occurs now in Congress on a daily basis, and with the warring factions between Republicans and Democrats, but not just in the United States of America. There was a poll, a survey done in Canada recently, which said the overwhelming majority of Canadians perceive that Canada has done sufficiently for Ukraine, and that we don't need either to do much more or any more at all. And we need to make sure, of course, that our governments can articulate why that is important, why it is important to support Ukraine, and therefore keep being able to do it. Thirdly, and equally linked to those other two, and they're all wrapped around each other, is the crucial concept of leadership as to continue to come from President Zelensky, who has inspired his people and the world to be able to continue fighting during the darkest days of their history, during their depths of despair. If Zelensky should go down for any reason, and I reflect back to what we talked about when we combated improvised explosive devices in Afghanistan, we could find and dismantle 99 out of 100. All the Taliban had to do was be successful with 1 out of 100, and we took a body blow. The Russians would love to remove Zelensky and his leadership and his inspiration from the field of battle, and they've only got to be successful one time to do it. He has to continue to be there to inspire, and then leadership has to come from the West. I'm talking about President Biden in the administration, obviously, and Prime Minister Sunak from Great Britain, but specifically President Biden and his administration, who have to provide that leadership to NATO, to the EU, and to the other countries that are engaged, in this case, importantly, Australia itself. The leadership has got to be determined to go forward here, provide that inspiration, and ensure there is no talk of a reset like 2014, that we give Putin and the Russians the option to say, this is all going to be over, we'll be back to normal in a couple of years. Last point I'll make, Russia has to continue doing what it's doing. That is to say, leaderless, brutal attacks, frontal assaults, taking thousands of losses, and what has got to occur for Ukraine to be successful in this next 12 to 36 months is that the resistance in Russia, both to Putin and to the war itself, the special military operation now in day 356 since the invasion last February, the resistance to that has got to grow, so it becomes a factor, and the number of Russian troops willing to go to the front under any circumstances and fight in Ukraine diminish greatly. That resistance has to grow, and Russia is going to enable that by its brutal and, in fact, many times idiotic tactics of frontal assaults and in the front of those kinds of weapons itself. Because Putin right now appears ready to sacrifice, 500,000 people, 750,000 soldiers, and appears right now to be able to do that and determined to do it. Ukraine cannot take the kind of losses that it would suffer to confront those numbers of Russian troops coming through. So that's what I believe are the important factors. Got to fight corruption, got to keep the West solidly unified in support of Ukraine, got to provide an inspirational leadership, both to keep people going in their hours of great despair and to actually provide the armaments from around the rest of the world. And Russia has got to have continue with its tactics, because that's going to enable the resistance to build over the longer term. Deborah, thank you.
Thank you, General Hillier. General Petraeus, you're up next.
Thanks, Deb, and great to be back with the Atlantic Council and with the Ukrainian World Congress in Paul, and together with, again, Generals Hillier, Clark, and Ryan. I fully support what General Hillier has just laid out. We are at another pivotal moment in the war in Ukraine, and I'd like to lay out my comments in terms of short-term, mid-term, and long-term imperatives. In the short term, as the ministers converge on Brussels for yet another ministerial gathering, it is crucial to recognize the threat right now of the ongoing Russian offensive to seize the rest of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. And therefore, there has to be a real focus on rushing the ammunition, other material, and supplies to Ukraine to enable them to conduct successful defensive operations, perhaps grudgingly giving up some small amounts of territory that are seized by the Russians in very costly operations. I'm sure that the listeners will have seen the UK Ministry of Defense observing that the losses in recent days have been over 850 Russian soldiers per day, something that even for Russia, even for a country that still thinks that it can outsuffer the Ukrainians, Europeans, and Americans, is unsustainable. Midterm, the imperative is, of course, to micromanage now, getting to Ukraine, the tanks that have been committed, the infantry fighting vehicles, the longer range precision munitions, the additional air defenses, and again, further ammunition, other wheeled armored vehicles, etc., as well as the training on them, not just for those who will operate them, but also for those who will maintain them, noting that that's often the more challenging task than that of actually operating, and the logistical supply chain, the iron mountains of spare parts and components and so forth, often plug in, plug out kinds of components for the more sophisticated elements of some of these Western armored vehicles. All of this is crucial to enable Ukraine to be ready by May, early June, whenever it is that they decide to conduct their own counteroffensive, hopefully to cut the land bridge that currently connects Russia proper to Crimea, to establish and then to isolate those forces that are on the western side of that, and to make life much more difficult for Ukraine, and to put within range of the new longer range systems that are provided for the high mobility artillery rocket system, now the ground launched small diameter bomb, which will be 150 kilometers precision munition and a larger warhead than the current one, to start to put some of those bases, headquarters and barracks and so forth, logistical depots in Crimea within range, put them at risk as well. And then long term, it's time for the ministers at Brussels to recognize certain imperatives that are just going to happen. There has to be a transition for Ukraine from Eastern Bloc aircraft, fighter bombers, MiG-29s, and so forth, to Western fighter bombers, because there are no more Eastern Bloc systems. The Eastern European countries that had those, by and large, those that were operationally ready, have been transitioning them to Ukraine. And over time, Ukraine is running out of those as well. They can only cannibalize so much. They literally have more pilots now than they have aircraft. And so at least deciding to allow the training of these pilots, and once again, the very important component of the mechanics and those who will have to maintain these aircraft, getting that going, even as they may defer the decision for some time to the specific numbers and specific type of aircraft, whether F-16, Eurofighter, or others. But this kind of decision-making has to go forward. And there also has to be a greater focus on what will the Marshall-like reconstruction plan consist of, who will lead it, presumably the US, G7, EU, and so on, but getting serious about that. And also what will be hugely important, and really the ultimate foundation that will be necessary for successful reconstruction of the damaged infrastructure in Ukraine. And that is, of course, an ironclad security guarantee, whether it is NATO membership, which even individuals who used to be concerned about the sensitivities in the Kremlin now say it is required. Dr. Henry Kissinger, in fact, has said that it's now appropriate to begin thinking about NATO membership. And if that's not possible because of one or more of the members of NATO, then it should be a US-led coalition of the willing. But without an ironclad security guarantee, that reconstruction plan won't be successful at the point when there are meaningful negotiations. And that's the final point. We have to do everything we can, again, short, medium term, long term, to enable Ukraine to hasten the moment when Vladimir Putin recognizes that this war is unsustainable on the battlefield because of the horrific losses that Russians are taking, even noting they think they can outsuffer, again, the Ukrainians, Europeans, and Americans. We have to prove him wrong in that regard. He's not going to be able to do to them what the Russian Empire did to Napoleon's army or the USSR did to the Nazis. We've got to ensure that, again, they can make this a reality on the battlefield. And meanwhile, the US-led Western coalition also has to tighten the financial, economic, and personal sanctions and export controls to make it very clear that the damage on the home front in Russia, which has already been set back by at least a decade with the loss of over 1,200 U.S. and Western firms or drawdown of them, that message has to get through so that there can be meaningful negotiations. I tend to believe that this will be ultimately the way this will end will be with a negotiated resolution. We have to hasten that moment when Vladimir Putin is willing to enter into meaningful negotiations, at which time, again, Ukraine can start to think seriously about reconstruction with our help and also an ironclad security guarantee. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, General Petraeus. General Clark, floor is yours.
Thanks, Deborah. Thanks to the Atlantic Council, Rick Hillier, for getting us together. It's a real pleasure and honor to be on this distinguished panel. I agree with what General Hillier and General Petraeus have said. They've said it very well, very comprehensively. So let me put this in perspective if I could. We're at an inflection point in world history with this battle. After this is settled, however it's settled, if Ukraine succeeds in driving out Russia from its territories, if Ukraine fails and ends up as a rump state, if the West holds together or if the West comes apart, moving forward will be different. However this ends, this is a very, very significant moment in world history. And this is not about simply getting through the next election. It's not about avoiding political controversy at home. This is equivalent to the buildup of World War II and something even more frightening because of the presence of nuclear weapons and China. This brings me to my second point. It's not possible to choose between, are we going to face Russia or are we going to face China? The United States and the West are facing both Russia and China. Both powers disagree with the way the world is structured today. Both powers want to split it apart. They want to go back to an earlier era of power politics, of the 19th century. Each country has its sphere of influence, and great powers will joust, argue, and fight at the boundaries. We've worked assiduously through 2 world wars and the Cold War and the post-Cold War to put together a system in which we encourage the peaceful settlement of disputes. We have the United Nations, international law. All of that is challenged by Russia and China. So the idea that we can stabilize, just get this over with in Ukraine, just stop it there because the losses are so heavy. And let's look at China. That's not going to be a successful policy. Both are connected. Success in helping Ukraine defend its territorial integrity and regain its territorial integrity will translate into deterrence of China. Failure in Ukraine will provide an opening for China to expand its territorial aspirations in Asia. It's that simple, but it's very hard to convey it and even harder to put it into policy at this point. So how would we do it? Well, point 3, you can win a war through the application of decisive force against the enemy's center of gravity. General Petraeus was part of that operation brilliantly when he commanded the 3rd Infantry Division in the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And we did strike Iraq's center of gravity, its armed forces, and shatter them with decisive force. Well, you can also win another way, through what we would call escalation dominance. In 1999, NATO achieved escalation dominance over Slobodan Milosevic's Serb military and its ethnic cleansing in Kosovo through a escalatory campaign of air strikes. We convinced Milosevic he couldn't win. And the final blow to Milosevic was when he was indicted for war crimes and knew that we were preparing or discussing about preparing a ground invasion of Kosovo to physically eject. At that point, Milosevic tossed in the towel. Well, we're not going to be able to succeed with escalation dominance here because we've already, at least superficially, tossed it out the window. We've said we want to be responsive to the battlefield. We want to be careful not to start World War III. We respect Putin's red lines. Nations in Europe are shaky. They're concerned. Germany's afraid. France is concerned. Eastern European nations know what's at risk here. But escalation dominance that could have been applied at the outset, we didn't do it. So what is the enemy center of gravity here that we're working against? It's Mr. Putin's mind. When he believes he cannot succeed, that's when this war will end, as General Petraeus said. That's it. That's the center of gravity, not tens of thousands of Russian troops dead. Now, for Ukraine, if Ukraine suffers a breakthrough, that breakthrough will undercut Western support and resolution. So Ukraine cannot afford battlefield failure. Russia can afford many battlefield casualties and failure as long as Putin believes he can ultimately succeed. What's emerged, you see, from the West, despite all the great work to hold NATO together, despite consensus building, despite the billions of dollars of military assistance provided to Ukraine, what's emerged is actually a policy of seeking to have a soft failure by both combatants. Russia couldn't succeed, couldn't move forward. It's blunted its force. Ukraine has bled out. It would like to regain Crimea, but it doesn't have the force to do it. And so let's go to the negotiating table. That's a policy that's unlikely to produce lasting success. The reason is Mr. Putin is determined to take Ukraine. He wants it. He wants it because he fears China in the long term. And without Ukraine, Russia is a rump state. It's a policy that's unlikely to work because the Ukrainians simply cannot politically, morally accept giving up their territory in a concession to aggression. And it's a policy that's short-sighted because what it says is that aggression is rewarded. So this idea of soft failure, being responsive to the battlefield, but being 2 steps behind what's needed for Ukraine to move forward, that's a losing policy. We've got to move past that. 4th point, in moving past it, we've got to come at Mr. Putin from all angles. I endorse everything that General Hillier and General Petraeus have said about the battlefield, near term, midterm, and long term. But it's not just war. It's not just military. It's all angles. It's economic. They need to be tightened sanctions. It's diplomatic. We need to be going after these nations that are sitting on the sidelines and helping them to understand what's at stake. It's legal. We need to be preparing and indicting Mr. Putin for war crimes. It's political in the sense that our leaders need to come to their publics and explain exactly what's at stake and why support for Ukraine to regain its territorial integrity is in our vital interest. And finally, it is military. We've got to give them the assistance they need. That's long-range weapon, more artillery, more ammunition, fighter aircraft, the long-range drones, and we've got to mobilize our industrial bases. We can't fight and survive the 2 challenge by doing business as usual. Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you, General Clark. General Ryan, over to you.
Thanks, Deborah. And it's a tough act to follow, the great advice and counsel of my predecessors. But there's just a couple of things I'd like to highlight, and I know we want to go to Q&A. So first thing I think that's really important as we move forward is developing strategic patience in the polities and the populations of the West. I mean, Ukraine's ultimate victory in this war will be built on the support that's provided by the West, as well as by the blood and sacrifice of the Ukrainian people. I actually have a lot of confidence in our populations to be patient here. I mean, if we have a look at Afghanistan for 20 years, we sustained our efforts there. And if we look at countries like Korea, we've done it for much longer. But what's important is providing the right purpose to our people. And I think we're very capable of doing that. Secondly, industrial expansion is vital. I know a couple of my honourable colleagues have mentioned that, but it's something that we've really let go since the end of the Cold War. Our capacity to design, to produce weapons, munitions, and a whole range of other things that are essential to warfare and to deterrence really needs to be expanded, not just for this war, but to deter, hopefully, other catastrophes in the future. I think if there were three imperatives that I'd like to conclude on, the first one is that there is a very strong humanitarian imperative for us to help Ukraine win this war quickly. We often forget the humanitarian imperative. I think it's a very important one for us to provide as much assistance as quickly as possible for them to win as quickly as we can. I think there's a strategic imperative outside the war to shift to a new strategic architecture for security in Europe. As much as there has been talk about Europe taking charge of its own security affairs, I think this war has shown it's still not quite there yet. Somehow we need to shift to that posture without the United States always having to be there and to back up every single security initiative there. And finally, I think we have a grand imperative to show that the narratives of Putin and Xi, particularly Xi, of the West is in decline, the East is rising, just are not right. In fact, I think we should all take great heart from the reinvigoration of NATO and the support of citizens around the world for Ukraine during this war. It's not something we've seen for some time. And I think that we should ensure that we're showing authoritarian regimes in the 21st century that democracy is precious everywhere and in all its forms, and that we should be doing all we can to protect it. So I'd like to conclude my thoughts there. Thank you very much for the invitation to join this august group, and I look forward to the discussion. Thanks, Deborah.
Thanks, General Ryan. I'm going to take a moderator's prerogative and I'm going to conflate some of the questions that I've been thinking of here because you all have done very good openings. So the first thing I'm going to say is that for those of you who know me, I'm an Appomattox kind of girl. So, and I wanted to address that up front because there has been much discussion in the press and among a number of governments about Ukraine foregoing any attempt to take back Crimea. For various reasons, they've been described as not being able militarily to do that. In fact, some have even suggested that Ukraine relinquish 20% of its territory and call it a day. Now, there are others, as all of you have said, that Ukraine can actually win, Russia can actually lose. And so I want to talk a little bit about what Ukraine actually needs to do right now to thwart this Russian counteroffensive and what it will need 6 months from now. So let me articulate that just a little bit further. As a NATO CHOD said to me last week, if you give them long-range fires now versus the end of the summer versus late fall or the winter, outcomes will be different. So let me open it up, and if you would all just give me a little nod, who wants to go first in trying to address that? Thanks. Volunteers. General.
Yes, Deborah.
Look, I think right now, as I mentioned, we've got to see what is necessary to help them hold off the Russian offensive. And I suspect that in this regard, this will be more ammunition. It will be helping to maintain the systems that we have already provided with spare parts and components and so forth. There will be a number of battlefield requirements. It may even be refined fuel products. Again, medical assistance. They need to identify these to us. I'm confident that that is happening. Actually, there is a headquarters that is established, a 3-star headquarters established in Germany, US-led, that is doing just that. Certainly, the decision-making now to provide advanced systems later on, I think, would be useful. And in that regard, let me just transition quickly to what will be needed later. As I mentioned, to help the Ukrainians achieve combined arms operations. So with something that Russia has not been able to accomplish. In other words, not just driving tanks down roads, but then to support them with infantry that keeps the enemy's infantry with anti-tank guided missiles off of them, artillery, mortars that suppress the enemy, engineers and EOD that reduce obstacles and defuse explosives, air defense to keep the enemy's rotary and fixed wing air support off you, your own air support to the extent that you have it, electronic warfare to jam the enemy, good command control communications, good logistics, all of this. Again, Ukraine and we together, just as happened before, it's publicly known that we wargamed the offensive in Kharkiv that was so highly successful. And they achieved a real maneuver warfare capability there that I think they can duplicate this time, noting that the defenses will be stronger against what it is likely that they will want to do. But we need to enable them to achieve combined arms operations and then to sustain them. That will be the difference between what the Ukrainians can do compared with what the Russians have been able to do. Certainly over time, again, there's no question about the imperative of Western aircraft. There's no question about, I think, even longer range precision munitions, but let's get the ground launched small diameter bomb in there first. But then there are some other requirements that I think do deserve additional attention. In particular, augmenting the air and ballistic missile and counter unmanned aerial system, early warning and defense, and trying to integrate that, make it more comprehensive to the extent that is possible, noting the challenges of trying to defend infrastructure across the country and the need, therefore, to prioritize the limited assets that they have. I think also getting serious about more advanced drones with better intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities and precision munitions, Hellfires, whatever, would be a huge contribution as well. But once again, what we're talking about are near-term requirements that have to be provided and near-term decisions that can enable longer term capabilities. And then over the midterm, as I mentioned, trying to identify what else do they need to ensure the success of the offensive that will be launched, according to the Ukrainians and all other observers, in the late May, June summer timeframe. Over.
Thank you, General. I'm going to throw out another piece to this and then call on General Hillier, who I think is motioning that he wants to say something. There has been a very piecemeal, drip, drip, drip approach to supplying these systems. This is unfortunate. And we do know that the White House has still objected to sending Reaper or Gray Eagle, and of course, ATACMS. General Hillier, over to you. How do we convince our leaders that this drip approach is not working, but is just resulting in more death and destruction?
Deborah and ladies and gentlemen, I just want to go back to some of the points that I made at the front end there about how important this is to keep President Zelensky as a leader is going to lead forward, if you will, and help win this war. What I'm reminded of when I listen to that question is what occurred in Bosnia when I was there with General David Petraeus and when General Wes Clark was sat here. And there was a growing movement to say, okay, why don't we just agree that whatever's in place now, we accept and move on from there? In other words, we would have rewarded ethnic cleansing. We would have rewarded the fact that the Bosnian Muslims were devastated, brutalized, and a terrible tragedy. And we would have forgotten the overriding principle of good versus evil. And I think that's what's at stake here. I don't think President Zelensky could stand and could remain in power, could remain as president, that inspirational leader that we need, if he accepted or was willing to accept giving up 20% of Ukraine. I don't think General Zaluzhny would actually accept that either. In fact, he made a statement several months ago, which really said that to the men and women of the Ukrainian defense forces who have suffered so greatly and accomplished so much already to in this war of survival, a negotiated peace giving up their land would not be acceptable. So I think we have to go back to, this is good versus evil. And it's been said here that, we need to have Putin in front of an international criminal tribunal, or at least indicted for that. And secondly, what General Petraeus has just said, all of those things have to take place. Thirdly, you have to win the fight in the eastern part of Ukraine first. And you can do that. And then Crimea becomes a separate issue militarily that you prepare for while you are winning the fight itself. I think we go back. This is good versus evil. This is not something we're going to negotiate away. And I would think that President Zelensky's starting point on negotiations would be, I'd be delighted to accept the surrender of every single Russian soldier standing on Ukrainian soil as a prelude to anything else that we want to walk through. I'll stop there.
So, Deborah, if I could come in, I agree with what General Hillier and General Petraeus have said. Let me put it this way: we've been responsive to the needs of the battlefield, and we're listening to the Ukrainians. But as General Petraeus said, most of these wars end with negotiations of some type, and the negotiations reflect the realities on the battlefield. The U.S. record in negotiations in the past has not been too good. We didn't do that well in Korea. We didn't do that well after the Gulf War in 1991 in our negotiations. And I think it's important that at the policy level, we decide in the West and agree on what conditions on the battlefield are needed to produce successful negotiations. And then, rather than waiting to respond to every Russian step and say, well, look at Bakhmut, they're bringing in infantry, quick, send in the anti-infantry, give us 105s, give us automatic grenade launchers, give us more machine guns so we can handle it. No, let's figure it out how we want the battlefield outcome to be so that we can end this through successful negotiations. What that means is getting ahead in the thought process. So as I look at the battlefield, from the Ukrainian standpoint, they've got to hold in Donbass, can't have a breakthrough. But the decisive terrain is Crimea. And so if you could hold Donbass, build up your offensive striking power, and get into Crimea, and that requires all the systems that my fellow panelists have mentioned, get in there quickly, you would force the negotiations that could end this fighting. But it can't be done by incremental supplies. 31 American tanks in 9 months, this is not realistic. And so if we really are smart, we connect the end state we're seeking with the military assistance we're willing to provide. That gives us the answer of what we need to provide Ukraine.
Deborah, if I can just quickly add a couple of comments to,
Absolutely.
I think, what were very comprehensive comments there. I think Crimea has to always be on the table. I mean, there's been a lot of people who would say, no, it's different. We need to do all these things and then think about Crimea. No, Crimea is part of the whole. It's a legal part of Ukraine. It's an important part of Zelensky's political strategy, and it has to be an important part of military strategy, that it is always in play and the Ukrainians want it back. And we need to reduce the hand-wringing among some political elites about that. It is militarily possible to take it back. But there's a whole lot of things that need to come before that, including taking back all of the South to have any hope of either placing Crimea at risk and forcing a Russian accommodation or actually taking it back. But I think the most important thing is Crimea has to be kept on the table as something the Ukraine wants back by force or by negotiation, and giving it some kind of special status is unnecessary and frankly unhelpful for Ukrainian Western strategy in this war.
Thank you. I was one of my questions I was going to ask, but I'm going to go to the audience because we're running short on time here, is that, I always like to say the enemy gets a vote. And I always like to say that the countries that live in the neighborhood have a far different perspective than some of the hand-wringers, as I like to say, west of Berlin. And I think we need to listen to those countries who believe that if Putin is not shorn in Ukraine, then he will look at tasty morsels in the Baltics, especially with their smaller militaries and defenses. And so from there, I want to leap over into another piece here, which is that Ukraine's become an innovation hub for modern military battle space. And I don't think we talk enough about this. We talk about how NATO countries have denuded their defense industry, that they're not keeping up with things. But I think there's a lot of lessons learned here that will end up saving our Western allies a lot of money in the long run and blood and treasure as well. And with that, I like to say that we need to talk about that more, because I think it would keep support for Ukraine much stronger in that regard. So I'm going to leap to one of the questions from Jake Howells. Should this war fuel greater conversations on the closer integration of NATO equipment and move away from nation-specific platforms? And the reason why I asked that, at one point in my conversations with a very senior Ukraine defense official, it was, we have 12 platforms using 4 different kinds of ammunition right now. And that to me shows that all of this vaunted discussion about NATO interoperability and being able to deploy and have great logistics lines is somewhat questionable. So I'd like to throw the question out here about, there are some lessons learned here that are vital for our own safety and security going forward, including Ukraine and this part of the world. And I'd like to hear from our military experts here on what they think about that.
So,
okay,
go ahead, General Clark, please.
I'm the old guy here. So I remember working for General Haig when he was NATO Supreme Allied Commander in 1978. And we were very worried about rationalization, standardization, integration of NATO systems. We published STANAGs, Standard NATO Agreements. We did get 155 ammunition standardized, 105 tank main gun, 7.62 NATO standard round. But when it came to taking on national armaments industries, that's a really tough problem, because it's connected to the political aspirations of the incumbents and also national strategic policies. France certainly doesn't want the United States to have a veto power over where it could sell Rafale fighter planes. And Europe doesn't want to lose the high-tech opportunities of investing in Typhoon, even though we knew at the time that Typhoon was a 4th-generation fighter, not a 5th-generation fighter. And so we fought these battles again and again and again. We did get a NATO AWACS. That was huge. But it's been a real struggle. So I think that's one of the lessons that we have to work at in a different way. With modern technology, in the old days in logistics, we used to get paper manuals of the parts system, and you had to get the update. And then we went to microfiche. Now it's online. Now we have systems like Amazon. We can handle multiple channels of spares, technical manuals, and so forth. And the Ukrainians can handle it. I'm sorry it's 12 different systems, but you're asking a lot if you ask countries to give up their national production.
Okay, so I want to know who else wants to talk, but I'm going to ask you to leave your answers very brief because we are running short on time. General Ryan, sorry.
Yes, interoperability doesn't require everyone to be exactly the same. We got through the Cold War without everyone being the same. What we do need is common values, common standards, and common frameworks for making decisions. Some level of variation in equipment and approaches is essential in an alliance because that underpins the essential to and fro and the competition of ideas that's vital in the alliances of democracies, and underpins the kind of learning system that we've seen the Ukrainians use so well in this war, and the Russians haven't. I'd also just say, finally, when we talk about integration, one of the transformative effects of this war, and there aren't a lot, most of the things we've seen in this war are continuities from previous wars, but one of the transformative things is the integration of military, government, and civil sources of intelligence, collection, analysis, and dissemination. And I think that it's something that governments and militaries are going to have to look at, how they do better in future, because it's resulted in a detection to destruction cycle now shorter than anything we've seen in any previous war. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question. This one is from Brigadier General Klaus Wittmann from Potsdam University. Regarding ironclad security guarantees that you raised, General Petraeus, what do you all think of Secretary General Rasmussen's Kiev Security Compact that was recently presented? And again, if you're going to answer, please keep your responses brief. General Petraeus.
Yeah, no, look, I think that's a great initiative. At the end of the day, the question is, how close to an Article 5 collective self-defense agreement can you get? The closer, the better. Best of all would be full-fledged NATO membership. If that's not practical, as I noted earlier, then perhaps some kind of US-led coalition of the willing. But it's going to have to be very significant. It's not just about arming Ukraine and helping them resist. This cannot be, again, a frozen conflict with new front lines. This has to be a dramatically transformed situation at the end of whatever negotiated resolution ends this war. And there can't be the chance of miscalculation or misperception at the end of it, as there was prior to the beginning of this particular war. And let me just add a little bit to what Mick Ryan just said. I think it's very important to note that there is incredible Ukrainian innovation. We all describe them as the ultimate MacGyver. They can adapt anything from, hang it under an F-16. It can be hung under a MiG-29. The local population using scanners to find and jam the Russian communication system, et cetera. But by and large, this is the Cold War that turned hot. This is what all of us prepared to fight back in the mid-1980s that had actually erupted into war. It's largely those systems, it's largely those tactics on the Russian side in particular. There are some glimpses of future warfare, but very, very few. The precision munitions are, now out to 150 kilometers. This is not what we would see, say, in an Indo-Pacific if the severe competition between the US and China erupted into conflict, something we obviously have to do everything we can to deter. But we should be very cautious about seeing this as the future of conflict, because it really is not, other than, again, you see some drones, you see, again, anti-tank guided missiles that are very capable. The biggest difference in this conflict over, say, what would have happened had the Cold War turned hot in the 1980s is the presence of smartphones, internet connectivity, and social media applications onto which videos and photos can be uploaded together with some narrative. The future of conflict is vastly different from this. We need to get more of what the future of conflict could be into the hands of the Ukrainians, but we shouldn't confuse this with what true future conflict might look like. Over.
Right, thank you. I'm going to ask one more question from the audience and ask responders to be very brief so we have time to go to our colleague Paul Grod. From Shruti Rubin, do you think that if Ukraine were to cut the land bridge and could actually start hitting bases very seriously in Crimea, that this would be enough to change Putin's mindset? I know my view on this, but I'd like to hear yours. Who would like to go first on this?
Let me very quickly start. I think it would also require demolishing the rest of the Kerch Strait Bridge. What you have to do is isolate Crimea completely and probably extend the range. Again, if you get on a map, and if you even can get Ukrainian forces very close with what are now sort of medium range precision munitions that will be provided for the high mobility artillery rocket system, it's 150 kilometers. You can do the arcs, and it does not put all of the bases, headquarters, airfields, and so forth at risk in Crimea. If you can put all of that at risk and isolate it by cutting the land bridge and by cutting the Kerch Strait Bridge, and then perhaps even starting to interdict the flow of the ferries and the ships that have traditionally supported it before the construction of the Kerch Strait Bridge and the railway, then I think you start to put that at risk. That could change some calculations, and you'd need to be doing those at that time. Thanks.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask, starting with General Clark, then General Ryan and General Hillier, you each have 1 minute to do a wrap up here.
Well, thanks, Deborah. Look, we've got to move more aggressively to provide Ukraine the military assistance it's needed. We've got to communicate more effectively with our publics as to why this is a vital Western interest. We've got to be willing to take the risks of crossing Mr. Putin's red line. We've got to decide where we want the battlefield to be in order to successfully end the war by negotiations. And just to put a point on what General Petraeus just said in conclusion, we've got to not only cut Kerch, disrupt the land bridge, we've got to get Ukrainian forces into Crimea and go after the Black Sea Fleet so that Putin realizes it's over. At that point, we'll give him the opportunity to peacefully withdraw.
General Ryan.
Thank you. I'd just like to wrap up by saying, for me, this is about three key elements. Firstly, it's about patience, strategic patience in the West, particularly the political elite, but in the population more broadly. It's about production. We need to be able to produce and get to Ukraine as much as we possibly can, as quickly as we possibly can. And finally, it's about sustaining and communicating purpose. That's something that General Zelensky has been superb at. He has probably reinvigorated the study of leadership single-handedly in the last year. And that's what we need to get us through this good leadership with purpose. Thank you.
Thank you. And General Hillier, your wrap-up comments, please.
Well, I would simply like to say this. We have to approach this in phases. We've been doing that at large, but we need to consolidate. We need one to help Ukraine win the war of survival. And that's what we've got. You know, it's been said numerous times, we cannot have Ukraine lose that war of survival. The war will end in victory. We got to make sure it's Ukraine's victory. Secondly, we've got to help Ukraine rebuild. And the military forces are part of that reconstruction. Yeah, you can win the war of survival, fight the war of survival with 12 systems or 18 systems. You cannot have a longer term military. I don't believe that's coherent and affordable with 12 or 18 systems. And so we have to help them rebuild the military as part of reconstruction. We have to help them then get to a level where they have that longer term security by helping them rebuild. And the last point I would make is I do not believe we're going to change Putin's mind. This war will end finally when Putin is gone. And he is not going to change his mind. He's shown that by the sacrifice he's willing to accept, not himself, but all of the young men and the families of Russia who are dying daily in the thousands, and the tragedy that he's visiting upon Ukraine. He will not change his mind.
Thank you. I have to say I agree with that. I would like to now ask my colleague Paul Grod from the World Ukrainian Congress to have a few final wrap-up words for us all here today. And I want to first thank all of you gentlemen for this very compelling discussion. And Paul, over to you.
Well, thank you, Deborah. Today's expert discussion on what Ukraine needs to win is the first event that the Ukrainian World Congress is organizing to commemorate 365 days of Ukraine's valiant defense against Russia's full-scale invasion and the 9th anniversary of Russia's war against Ukraine. We are organizing events at the United Nations together with Ukraine's mission, and we're coordinating rallies in over 65 countries around the world to support Ukraine. Among our objectives is to ensure support for Ukraine with civil society around the world, while encouraging the international community to provide Ukraine with the weapons it needs to liberate its people and territories from Russia's brutal and genocidal occupation. I encourage you to visit the UkrainianWorldCongress.org site and our social media channels to learn more about the rallies and events that will be taking place around the world on and around February 24th. This has been a fascinating masterclass on what strategies and support will best ensure that Ukraine wins in 2023. Having visited Ukraine several times since February 24th, 2022, I am confident that President Zelensky, the cabinet of ministers, and the Parliament of Ukraine are doing everything possible to combat both Ukraine's internal challenges and external enemies. I'd like to thank everyone who helped make this important discussion possible, in particular, Ambassador John Herbst and the Atlantic Council team, the leadership of Deborah Kagan of the Transatlantic Leadership Network, and our speakers today from the Ukrainian World Congress's Strategic Advisory Council, Generals Rick Hillier, Wesley Clark, David Petraeus, and Mick Ryan. The Ukrainian people around the world are extremely grateful to have all of you as such committed and capable friends. I expect that your wise advice is heeded by global leaders, and they provide Ukraine everything it needs to win in 2023. Thank you, and Slava Ukraini.
Thank you all, and thank you and our audience today for participating. We really appreciate it. And gentlemen, I look forward to working with you again in the very near future. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.